Today's story comes to us from a man named Graham Bass, who lives in Australia. And the name of the book is My Grandma Lived in Gula Gulch. It was always one of my favorites to read to my sons. My Grandma Lived in Gula Gulch by Graham Bass. And Graham Bass also did all of the illustrations in the book. My grandma lived in Gula Gulch near Bandawallop East, a fair way north of Murrumbun, 500 miles at least, a little west of Lawson's Rest and south of Johnson's Gap, and nowhere much near anywhere that shows up on the map. Now Gula Gulch has got a pub, a main street with a hall, a petrol pump that doesn't work, and not much else at all. Except for Grandma, dear old Gran, and this I say with pride, for Gran it was that made old Gully famous far and wide. In Sydney and in Melbourne town, they all knew Grandma's name and all about the animals that Grandma used to tame. And if a stranger came to town, perhaps just passing through, he'd see my grandma riding by atop a kangaroo, or sometimes in a two-wheeled gig, a wombat at the bit, and next to Grandma in the back, a bandicoot would sit. The townsfolk thought it very odd, but Grandma took no heed. She said that she enjoyed the view upon her hopping steed. And as for training wombats, well, it took no time at all to teach them how to pull a gig and come and go at call. Now Grandma lived just out of town, a mile beyond the pub, down by a little billabong that nestled in the scrub. Upon a hillside ringed with trees, her rambling mansion stood, a jumbled maze of tin and canvas, bits of string and wood. And from a window out the back, she'd sit and watch the galas fly down beside the pool and drink beneath the evening stars. In years gone by, the house was full of birds both big and small, rosellas, eagles, coots, and magpies roosting in the hall, while in the tiny living room an old goanna sat and played a game of two-up with a dingo and a rat. My grandma whiled the hours away, conversing with a coot, or listening to the wombat play a tune upon his lute. There was a time, the locals say, when emus came to dine and stood about all evening drinking eucalyptus wine. They dressed for the occasion, looking rather out of date, and were spreading idle gossip in a less than sober state. But then a frill-necked lizard gave one ancient bird a scare, and the dinner guests all panicked, running madly here and there. Some kookaburras heard the noise and came to watch the show, and laughed so much that Grandma sternly told them all to go. By the time the fuss was over, there was not a guest in sight. But then that's the way with emus. Grandma said they're not too bright. One year, when it was very hot, old Grandma went away and took the wombat with her on a seaside holiday. She didn't go by elephant or on a polar bear. Besides, you ought to know you don't find elephants up there. She didn't own a camel, and they cost too much to buy, So Grandma bought some goggles and decided she would fly. The eagle wouldn't take them, and the coot was far too weak. But a pelican consented, so they climbed into its beak. And off they flew, quite low at first, then climbing very high. And as they turned towards the sea, the wombat waved goodbye. They flew across the desert sands and over mountains too, until at dusk they reached a place where giant tree ferns grew. And the pelican came gliding down to land beside a creek, and Grandma and the wombat climbed down gladly from its beak. Then while the pelican relaxed and Grandma cooked the tea, the wombat wandered down the creek to see what he could see. The trees were full of creatures with unfriendly, glowing eyes, and giant furry spiders hunted giant furry flies. A baby tree snake slithered by and gave him such a start that poor old wombat turned and fled with terror in his heart. And so they spent the night there, but the wombat stayed awake, looking nervously around him for a wombat-eating snake. When morning came, they journeyed on and reached the sea at last. The rolling waves came crashing in. The tide was running fast. But undeterred, my Grandma donned her frilly bathing gear and dived into the foaming surf without a trace of fear. She sat upon her blow-up horse while Wombat went to sleep. The pelican went fishing where the sea was not so deep. But when the Wombat woke, the tide had carried her away, and no one's seen my Grandma even to this very day. And yet I have a feeling that my Grandma's still alive, having drifted to an island where she managed to survive. From there perhaps she made her way to England or to Spain, or maybe San Francisco on a Western railway train. She could be taming tigers in the jungles of Tingor. But I think she's back in Gula Gulch just like before. I hope everyone enjoyed today's story and look forward to next week when we'll have even more stories for you. Everybody have a good day, stay safe, wash your hands, and remember, Jesus loves you and so do we.